A 3,000-year-old text does describe bodies destroyed by fire. No church has ever stayed quiet about cremation either, publishing detailed positions at least 6 separate times since 1886. Yet someone still built a claim treating a giant's punishment scene as a secret modern verdict on funeral ash. What the actual passage says on the record is, not that at all. What the Book of Enoch actually is. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish text built around the biblical figure Enoch. Genesis describes Enoch as the great-grandfather of Noah, a man who walked with God and was taken up before he died a normal death. Scholars date the writing of 1st Enoch to somewhere between roughly 300 BC and the start of the 1st century AD, and it was not written by one person in one sitting. It is a collection of 5 separate sections, written across different generations, known as the Book of Watchers, the Book of Parables, an astronomical book, a book of dream visions, and an epistle of Enoch. The oldest and most read section, the Book of Watchers, expands on a strange 4-verse passage in Genesis chapter 6. That passage briefly mentions heavenly beings taking human wives and producing offspring before the flood. The Book of Enoch turns those 4 verses into a full story. A group of angels called the Watchers rebel against heaven, come down to earth, marry human women, and father a race of giants whose violence helps justify the flood that follows. That short expansion sets up almost everything the rest of the book cares about, including judgment, punishment, and what actually happens to a body after death. The specific fire passage that modern claims point to as a revelation about cremation sits inside this same story, and it has been sitting there in plain English translation since long before anyone started attaching modern funeral questions to it. The passage. People point to. Chapter 16 of the Book of Watchers describes what happens to the giant offspring of the Watchers after they die in the wars, described earlier in the same story. The verse states that once the spirits leave their bodies, their flesh will be destroyed before the day of judgment. This is the specific line that recent claims point to when suggesting the Book of Enoch reveals what happens to cremated people. Reading the surrounding chapters makes the actual context unmistakable. This verse sits inside a passage specifically about the giants, the violent, half-angelic offspring born from the Watchers' union with human women, not about ordinary human beings in general, and certainly not about anyone's personal choice of funeral method thousands of years after the text was written. The destruction described here is framed as a punishment tied to their specific, cursed origin, part of a larger judgment scene that also describes the Watchers themselves being bound and cast into what the text calls an abyss of fire. Nothing in the passage distinguishes between how a person's body was disposed of during their lifetime, buried, cremated, lost at sea, or otherwise, since the text is not addressing funeral practices at all. That distinction, giants under a specific divine judgment versus an ordinary person choosing cremation for practical reasons, matters enormously. Once you understand exactly how far removed the entire idea of cremation was from the world that actually produced this text in the first place, why this isn't about cremation at all. Cremation, as most people understand it today, a deliberate, chosen method of disposing of a body after natural death, does not appear anywhere in the Book of Enoch as a subject the text is actually discussing. The destruction of flesh described in chapter 16 is punishment imagery tied specifically to the giant's violent, corrupted nature, part of the same broader judgment sequence that includes mountains melting like wax in chapter 1, and a massive fire with columns descending into an unmeasurable abyss in chapter 18. Later chapters build on the same fire and judgment theme repeatedly. Chapter 14 describes Enoch approaching God's throne directly, surrounded by flaming fire so bright that none of the angels standing nearby could look at it. A section called The Animal Apocalypse, found inside the later dream visions, retells the entire Watchers and Flood story using animals as symbols, ending its own version of the judgment scene with the corrupted thrown into a fiery abyss. That repetition across multiple sections written at different times tells scholars this fire and judgment imagery was a core recurring theme running through the whole tradition, not a single throwaway line about cremated human ash that a modern reader could reasonably extract and apply to their own funeral choices. None of this uses any word equivalent to cremation, and none of it describes a funeral practice of any kind. Understanding exactly why the text never once addresses cremation as an actual funeral option requires understanding what the people who wrote this book and the wider Jewish world around them actually did with their own dead. What ancient Israelites actually did with their dead. The ancient Israelites did not practice cremation. There's no archaeological evidence they ever did, and the biblical record consistently describes burial, in the ground or in carved rock tombs, as the standard way of handling a body. Genesis describes Abraham purchasing a burial cave for Sarah, and Deuteronomy commands that even an executed criminal be buried the same day. The text describes God himself burying Moses in an unmarked grave. During the Second Temple period, the same era that produced the Book of Enoch, wealthier Judean families would place a body in a rock-cut tomb, let it decompose naturally over roughly a year, then gather the bones into a carved limestone box called an ossuary, often inscribed with the person's name, and keep it in the family tomb. That practice stands in direct contrast to cremation, which destroys the bones rather than preserving them. The one clear exception in the Hebrew Bible is King Saul. After the Philistines mutilated his body and displayed it on a city wall, men from Jabesh Gilead recovered and burned his remains before burying the bones under a tree. Scholars generally read this as a specific act of rescue from further desecration, not a normal burial custom. The Roman historian Tacitus later noted the same pattern from the outside, writing plainly that Jews bury rather than burn their dead, notable since cremation was extremely common across the surrounding Greco-Roman world. That contrast, a community that consistently buried its dead inside a world that regularly cremated its own, is exactly the backdrop the Book of Enoch was written against. A text produced by a community that essentially never practiced cremation had no real reason to address it as a funeral option at all, which is why chapter 16's fire imagery targets giants under divine punishment, not anyone's chosen method of burial. The four chambers where the dead wait. Chapter 22 of the Book of Watchers describes Enoch being led by the angel Raphael to a large high mountain of hard rock somewhere in the west, containing 4 deep, smooth, hollow places carved into the stone. Raphael explains that these hollow places were created specifically so the spirits of every dead person, righteous and wicked alike, would gather and wait inside them until the final judgment arrives. The text describes each hollow space serving a distinct purpose. One holds the righteous, kept in a place with a bright spring of water, comfortable and at peace while they wait. A second holds sinners who were never punished for their wrongdoing during their lifetime, and their spirits stay separated there in considerable pain until the day of judgment. A third holds the spirits of those who were wronged or killed unjustly, described as continuing to petition for justice regarding their own deaths. A fourth compartment holds the worst sinners, described as complete in wrongdoing, and the text states plainly that their spirits will not be killed on the day of judgment, and will not rise from that place at all. Notably, this entire framework describes where a person's spirit goes after death, with no distinction whatsoever tied to how their physical body was actually disposed of beforehand. A person's fate in this system depends on how they lived, not on whether their remains were buried, cremated, or lost entirely, a detail worth keeping in mind, given how much modern content tries to tie this same book to specific opinions about cremation. Understanding exactly what happens to the spirits that do eventually rise again means turning to a separate, later section of the same book that deals with resurrection far more directly. The resurrection that already appears in the text. The Book of Parables, one of the 5 sections of 1st Enoch, contains the book's clearest resurrection statements in chapters 51 and 61. Chapter 51 describes the earth giving back what was entrusted to it, and Sheol giving back what it owes, language scholars read as buried bodies and departed spirits both being restored together. The same chapter describes the righteous dwelling and walking on the earth, consistent with a full, embodied return, rather than a purely spiritual one. Scholars including George Nicholsburg and James Vanderkam have debated exactly how physical this resurrection is meant to be, since different Ethiopic manuscripts and verses can be read either way. Researcher Mark Finney has argued that chapter 51's specific pairing of earth and Sheol, plus its image of the righteous walking the earth, points toward a genuinely embodied resurrection rather than the soul alone surviving. This is one of the clearest and earliest Jewish descriptions of a future bodily resurrection outside the Hebrew Bible itself, written centuries before Christianity existed. Neither chapter says anything about what happens to someone cremated versus buried, since the text describes a future, divinely enacted restoration, not a comment on how remains are handled in the meantime. That same resurrection-focused theology, inherited from Second Temple Judaism, is exactly what early Christianity carried forward into its own strong historical preference for burial over cremation. If ancient texts and real research like this are your kind of thing, subscribing helps this channel keep making them. How early Christianity inherited this same aversion. Early Christianity emerged directly out of the same Jewish burial tradition just described, and the earliest Christian writers carried that same near-universal preference for burial forward as their own default practice. Tertullian, writing around 200 AD, provides direct testimony that early Christians buried their dead rather than cremating them, and later, Christian writers repeatedly stressed a direct theological analogy between the physical resurrection of the body and the resurrection of Christ himself, an analogy that made burial feel considerably more consistent with core Christian belief than burning a body to ash ever could. That preference hardened considerably further once Christianity spread across the wider Roman world, a world where cremation had actually been the culturally dominant practice for centuries. Early Christians deliberately used burial as a visible point of difference from the surrounding pagan culture, and later European Christian societies took that same aversion even further. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne formally outlawed cremation in 789 AD, making it punishable by death specifically because of its continued association with pre-Christian pagan burial customs. Medieval Christian Europe added an even darker layer to that same aversion, since convicted heretics were often executed by burning at the stake, effectively a forced cremation used specifically as a mark of damnation and exclusion from the Christian community, while ordinary believers received burial. Fire itself became closely associated with divine judgment and punishment in the medieval Christian imagination, reinforcing the idea that burning was something reserved for the condemned rather than something an ordinary believer would ever choose for their own body. That same historical aversion, inherited from ancient Israel, reinforced through deliberate cultural separation from Greco-Roman paganism, and hardened further by medieval associations between fire and heresy, is the actual, well-documented reason cremation carried such a strong, negative association across most of Christian history. It has nothing to do with a secret, unspoken passage in the Book of Enoch, and everything to do with a long, thoroughly recorded cultural and theological history that historians have written about extensively for generations. Why the Church never says it doesn't hold up. Checking the claim that any church stays silent about cremation runs into an immediate problem, since the Catholic Church has published detailed, public teaching on it repeatedly over the past 60 years, covered extensively by major outlets each time. The Church formally banned cremation in 1886, tied to the same association between cremation and anti-religious secularism spreading across 19th century Europe. In 1963, the Vatican reversed course with an instruction called Piam et Constantem, permitting cremation as long as it wasn't chosen to deny belief in the resurrection. That permission was written into the Code of Canon Law in 1983 and the Eastern Code in 1990. The Church kept adding detail publicly. In 1997, cremated remains were permitted at full funeral liturgies. In 2016, a detailed instruction called Ad Resurgendum Cum Christo stated, ashes must be buried or kept in a sacred place, not scattered, divided among family, or kept at home except in rare approved cases. Cardinal Muller explained the reasoning directly to reporters, saying a human body isn't private property, and the Church shows its faith in the resurrection by caring for physical remains. In December 2023, the Vatican issued a further clarification, allowing families to keep a small portion of ashes somewhere personally significant, while still requiring the rest to be permanently buried. 6 separate, dated, publicly reported Vatican statements from 1886 to 2023 is about as far from silence as an institution gets. Other traditions have been just as vocal, landing in different places. The Eastern Orthodox Church has openly discouraged cremation since at least 1961, when the ecumenical patriarch called it contrary to the weight of Christian custom. Protestant denominations generally leave the choice to individual conscience. Within Judaism, Orthodox and conservative authorities hold that Jewish law requires burial, citing the Talmud and Maimonides, while the Reform movement has taken a more flexible stance since the 1880s, a position that grew more emotionally charged after the Holocaust. Whatever concern drives the claim that a church stays silent on cremation, the documented record across Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and Jewish tradition shows the opposite. The New Testament connection. The Epistle of Jude, a short letter included in the New Testament, quotes the Book of Enoch by name and by content. Verses 14 and 15 of Jude echo a prophecy attributed to Enoch, describing him as the 7th generation from Adam, and repeating a specific line about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to carry out judgment. This is not a loose thematic echo. The wording is close enough that scholars treat it as a direct quotation, the same way another New Testament writer might quote directly from Isaiah or the Psalms. Early church writers noticed this connection right away. Tertullian, the same Christian author who documented early Christian burial practices, also treated the Book of Enoch as a legitimate and useful text, partly because Jude had already quoted it as though it carried real authority. For a stretch of early Christian history, this book sat in an unusual spot, respected and referenced by name, yet never formally locked into the official canon most churches would eventually settle on. That unresolved status set up exactly the kind of slow fade that would eventually strip this book almost entirely out of Western hands, even while its judgment and fire imagery kept echoing through later Christian ideas about final judgment. The book that vanished from the West. Despite its early influence, the Book of Enoch was left out of the canon, accepted by Rabbinic Judaism and by nearly every Christian tradition that developed in Europe, including Catholic, Orthodox, and later Protestant churches. In the centuries following the early Christian period, full copies of the text stopped circulating across most of the ancient and medieval world. By around 400 AD, European scholars only knew the book through scattered quotations preserved inside other, unrelated writings, along with a partial Greek manuscript. There was exactly one place where this did not happen. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, along with the closely related Eritrean Orthodox Church, preserved the complete text continuously, translated into Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, and treated it as fully canonical scripture, sitting right alongside the rest of the Bible. While the rest of Christianity slowly forgot the book existed in complete form, Ethiopian churches kept copying, reading, and using it in worship without any interruption at all. For roughly 13 centuries, that made Ethiopia the only place on earth where a complete copy of this book still existed, sitting almost entirely outside the awareness of European scholars who assumed it was lost for good. The explorer who brought it back. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia while searching for the source of the Blue Nile. During his travels, he obtained several Ethiopic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch and brought them back to Europe, reintroducing the complete text to Western scholarship for the first time in over 1,000 years. It took decades for that reintroduction to reach ordinary readers. In 1821, Richard Lawrence, a scholar at Oxford, produced the first full English translation based on the Ethiopic manuscripts Bruce had recovered. Later, scholar R.H. Charles produced a more detailed, heavily annotated translation, first in 1893 and then in an expanded 1912 edition, which became the standard English version used by researchers for most of the century that followed. A separate discovery in Egypt, at a site called Akhmim in 1886 and 1887, turned up a partial Greek manuscript covering roughly the first third of the text, giving scholars an independent ancient source to compare against the Ethiopic version. None of this proved the book was actually ancient, rather than a later invention dressed up to look old. That proof would not arrive until the middle of the 20th century, and it came from a location nobody expected, proving it was not a later fake. Between 1947 and 1956, a collection of ancient manuscripts now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered in caves near Qumran, close to the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Among the roughly 900 texts pulled from these caves, researchers identified fragments of 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts containing portions of the Book of Enoch, dating from approximately 200 BC to 50 BC. Aramaic was the everyday spoken language of Judea at the time, the same language most scholars believe Jesus spoke, and finding the book written in this language, this early, settled a debate that had lingered for over a century. Before this discovery, critics could reasonably argue that the version preserved in Ethiopia might be a later fabrication, assembled long after the fact, and falsely presented as ancient. The Qumran fragments made that argument essentially impossible to sustain. 11 separate copies is a genuinely striking number. For comparison, the same caves produced only 4 surviving manuscript copies of the Song of Solomon, 4 of Ruth, 3 of Ecclesiastes, and 0 of the Book of Esther, despite Esther appearing in every Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Bible printed today. Researcher Joseph T. Millick led much of the early work identifying and publishing these Aramaic fragments. The same caves also produced 9 separate Aramaic manuscripts of a related text called the Book of Giants, which expands further on the same angelic rebellion story, but was never folded into the Book of Enoch itself. Notably, chapter 16's specific passage about the giant's flesh being destroyed appears within material that these Aramaic fragments do help confirm as genuinely ancient, part of the earliest, most widely copied section of the entire book, the Book of Watchers, rather than a later edition. That layered, multi-author history is not unusual for ancient religious texts, but it directly affects how carefully any claim about the book's specific fire imagery needs to be handled, since confirming a passage is ancient says nothing at all about whether it was ever meant to address a modern funeral practice like cremation. The missing section. Every part of the Book of Enoch showed up somewhere, among the Qumran fragments except one. The Book of Parables spans chapters 37 through 71 and contains some of the text's most theologically significant material, including the resurrection language found in chapters 51 and 61, discussed earlier. Scholars generally read this absence as meaningful rather than accidental. If the Qumran community was copying every other section of the book repeatedly, and even went out of its way to preserve the separate Book of Giants, it seems unlikely that a widely read Book of Parables would have simply escaped their attention by pure chance. The more common explanation is that this section developed later, or within a different religious circle, than the one responsible for the Qumran collection, meaning the book's clearest resurrection language actually comes from a somewhat separate, later strand of the overall Enoch tradition than the earlier chapter 16 fire imagery does. That layered, multi-author history is not unusual for ancient religious texts, but it adds one more piece of complexity worth remembering whenever someone tries to treat different sections of this composite book as though they were all written with a single, unified purpose in mind, including any purpose related to modern cremation. Why it never made the cut. Despite its clear popularity at Qumran, its direct quotation in the letter of Jude, and its respected status among early writers like Tertullian, the Book of Enoch was ultimately left out of the canon adopted by Rabbinic Judaism and by the vast majority of Christian traditions that took shape in the following centuries. Exactly why any individual text made it into a final canon, while another did not, is rarely a simple story, and Enoch's case involves theological concerns, questions about who actually wrote it, and the simple fact that once a text stops being copied and circulated in a region, it naturally drifts out of consideration for formal inclusion. Part of the hesitation among later church authorities also came from the fact that the text blurred a line. Most Orthodox theology tried to keep firm, describing evil as something that began among heavenly beings themselves, rather than starting purely as a human failing in the Garden of Eden. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church remains the clear exception to that pattern, continuing to treat the book as canonical scripture to this day, fully integrated into its liturgy and theology rather than treated as a curiosity. That single unbroken thread of continuous use is largely why a complete version of the text survived at all, and it is the exact reason James Bruce had somewhere to find it in 1773 when the rest of the Christian world had already lost track of it completely. Verdict. Here is where things actually stand. The real Book of Enoch, recovered in complete form only through the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's unbroken 13th century preservation, and confirmed as genuinely ancient once 11 Aramaic fragments turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, describes the giant's flesh being destroyed in chapter 16 as part of a specific divine judgment against corrupted angelic offspring, alongside a broader fire and judgment theme repeated across chapters 1, 14, and 18. A separate section, chapter 22, describes 4 holding chambers where every human spirit waits for final judgment, sorted entirely by how the person lived rather than by how their body was disposed of, while chapters 51 and 61 from the later Book of Parables describe a genuine embodied resurrection of the righteous. None of that material was ever written to address cremation as a modern funeral choice, since the ancient Israelite and early Jewish world that produced this text overwhelmingly practiced burial, reserving burning of a body for extreme or shameful circumstances, like the desecrated corpse of King Saul. Early Christianity inherited that same preference, reinforced through deliberate separation from Greco-Roman pagan cremation customs, and hardened further by the medieval association between fire and executed heretics. Far from staying silent, the Catholic Church has published detailed public teaching on cremation repeatedly, from an 1886 ban through a 1963 reversal, formal incorporation into canon law in 1983 and 1990, expanded funeral guidance in 1997, a detailed instruction in 2016, and a further clarification in 2023, while the Eastern Orthodox Church, various Protestant denominations, and multiple branches of Judaism have each stated their own clear, public positions on the same question. The real story here was never a hidden ancient revelation about cremated ash. It was a fire and judgment passage about rebellious angels and their monstrous children, sitting inside a text that survived disappearance, rediscovery, and rigorous scientific dating, next to a long, thoroughly documented, and genuinely public history of religious institutions saying exactly what they think about cremation, loudly and on the record, for well over a century. If you want more deep dives that separate what is actually real from what is just a good headline, subscribing costs nothing and keeps this channel chasing down stories exactly like it.